The air inside the shop was thick with the scent of roses and something far more sinister. The moment Tommy stepped through the door, a cloth clamped over his face, suffocating, sickly sweet. His vision blurred. A scream rang out. Then darkness. When he opened his eyes, handcuffs glinted in the dim light. A woman struggled against an iron grip, and behind it all, a pair of familiar, piercing eyes watched him. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. Tommy leaned back in his chair, watching Tuppence as she triumphantly waved a half-eaten scone in the air. "My dear fellow, she declared, her voice dripping with dramatic flair. Tommy smirked, folding his arms. "And who, pray tell, are we today?" Tuppence's eyes gleamed mischievously. "The great Dr. Montague, of course. And you, well, you dear Tommy, are the ever-efficient Inspector Harrington." "Charming," Tommy muttered. "Except that Montague deals with gruesome deaths and ghastly murders. Should I be concerned?" Instead of answering, Tuppence tossed a letter onto the table. Tommy picked it up, his brow furrowing. "Ambassador Charles Hargreaves, the American diplomat." Tuppence nodded. "And he wishes to see us, urgently." The following morning, at precisely 11, Charles Hargreaves, United States Ambassador to the Court of St. James, was ushered into the office. A tall man with a face lined by years of negotiation and power, he sat down with measured precision. "Mr. Blunt, I assume?" he asked, his voice deliberate and controlled. Tommy inclined his head. "At your service," Hargreaves exhaled, drumming his fingers against the polished mahogany desk. "This matter is not one for Scotland Yard. No crime has been committed, at least not in any conventional sense, but something about it gnaws at me." Tommy leaned forward. "I'm listening," Hargreaves continued, his tone carrying the weight of a man accustomed to diplomacy, but troubled by uncertainty. "I arrived last week aboard the Lexington. My luggage was delivered to my residence without incident, so I thought. But later that evening, my valet noticed something peculiar, a small tear on the inside lining of my travel case, one that I did not remember being there. I dismissed it as a minor detail, until, the following morning, an anonymous note was slipped under my door, 5 words written in a hurried scrawl. The exchange was no accident." He paused, allowing the words to settle. Tommy and Tuppence exchanged a glance. "You're certain the bags weren't switched?" Tommy asked. Hargreaves nodded. "I checked everything. My clothes, documents, personal belongings, nothing missing, nothing added. Yet I cannot shake the feeling that something is amiss." Tuppence tapped her chin thoughtfully. "A warning without a crime. That's a rare occurrence." Hargreaves leaned in slightly, his eyes darkening. "Perhaps. But last night my home was searched. The locks weren't forced. Nothing was stolen, yet my entire study had been rifled through. Whoever did it was looking for something." Silence stretched between them before Tommy finally spoke, his voice lower, serious. "Then we are left with 2 possibilities, Mr. Hargreaves. Either there was something in that case that you never realized was there, or someone thinks there was." A shadow passed over the ambassador's face. "And if it's the latter?" Tuppence smiled, the excitement of the chase gleaming in her eyes. "Then, Mr. Hargreaves, you've just given us a mystery worth solving." Tommy leaned back in his chair, watching Tuppence with amused curiosity, as she slathered an unhealthy amount of butter onto a warm muffin. She caught his gaze, grinned mischievously, and declared, "My dear fellow, we must be exceedingly careful." Tommy smirked, recognizing the game immediately. "Ah, I see you're being Dr. Fortune, and I suppose that makes me Superintendent Bell." "Precisely," Tuppence beamed, taking a triumphant bite. "And why, pray tell, are you suddenly channeling Reginald Fortune?" "Because," she said grandly, "I feel like something warm, rich and slightly scandalous." Tommy chuckled. "You do realize Dr. Fortune deals with all sorts of ghastly things, bodies in ditches, smashed skulls, unpleasantly expired people." Tuppence merely shrugged, and slid an envelope across the table. Tommy picked it up, eyebrows arching in surprise. "Randolph Wilmot, the American ambassador. What on earth does he want with us? We'll find out tomorrow at 11 sharp." Sure enough, the next morning, the dignified and imposing figure of Randolph Wilmot, was shown into Mr. Blunt's office. The ambassador cleared his throat, his voice carrying the deliberate weight of a man accustomed to high-stakes diplomacy. "Mr. Blunt, I presume." Tommy inclined his head. "Theodore Blunt, at your service." Wilmot nodded approvingly. "I prefer dealing with heads of departments, more efficient." He settled himself in the chair. "This is a small matter, nothing that would concern Scotland Yard. I haven't lost a penny, and it's probably all some absurd mistake, but it bothers me nonetheless. I dislike not understanding how a thing happened." Tommy leaned forward with interest. "Please, go on." Wilmot explained, methodically detailing the events. He had arrived a week ago on the liner Nomadic, only to discover that his luggage had been swapped with that of a certain Senator Ralph Westerham, whose initials, R.W., matched his own. The mistake had been rectified almost immediately, with the missing kit bag returned to the embassy, and Westerham's bag retrieved. "Straightforward enough," Tommy mused. "Except," Wilmot interrupted, "when I mentioned it to Westerham in passing, he was utterly confused. He denied taking my bag. He claimed he had never traveled with such an item at all." Tommy frowned. "Curious. If your bag had been stolen, that would be one thing, but it wasn't stolen, was it? It was returned." Wilmot nodded. "Exactly. Why go through the trouble? If it was a mistake, why use Westerham's name?" He exhaled sharply. "It's ridiculous, but I can't let it go. I need to know why it happened." Tommy tapped his fingers on the desk thoughtfully. "Did you notice anything missing from your bag?" "Not a thing," Wilmot replied. "My valet checked. Everything was intact." "And what was inside, if I may ask?" Wilmot hesitated before saying, "Boots." Tommy blinked. "Boots." Wilmot nodded. "Mostly boots." Tommy let out a low whistle. "That's unexpected." "Indeed," Wilmot agreed, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "Unless international diplomacy now involves smuggling secrets in shoe heels, I don't see why anyone would go to such lengths." Tommy leaned forward, intrigued. "Who came to retrieve the other bag?" "A man claiming to be Westerham's servant. My valet saw nothing unusual about him." "Had the bag been unpacked?" Wilmot shrugged. "I assume not, but my valet can tell you more." He handed Tommy a card. "Richard's at the embassy. He'll answer any questions you have." As Wilmot left, Tommy turned to Tuppence, who had been diligently scribbling notes. "Well," he asked, "see any rhyme or reason in this madness?" Tuppence tapped her pencil against her chin, eyes alight with curiosity. "Oh, my dear fellow," she murmured, "I do believe we're in for a rather thrilling game." Detective Julian Hayes leaned back in his chair, tapping a pencil against his desk as he listened to the frantic voice on the other end of the line. Senator Whitmore was livid. "I tell you, Hayes, this whole thing is absurd. My name used, my bag swapped. It's preposterous." Hayes narrowed his eyes. A misplaced diplomatic bag was one thing, but a staged mix-up involving an influential senator reeked of something deeper. The real question was, why? Moments later, standing in the grand foyer of the Whitmore estate, he faced the senator's valet, a nervous man who fidgeted with the cuffs of his pressed uniform. "The man who took the bag," Hayes said coolly. "Describe him." The valet hesitated, middle-aged, grey hair, spoke with certainty, but now I can't recall his face properly. It's as if he wanted to be forgotten. That single sentence sent a chill through Hayes. A trained deceiver then. He crouched beside the suitcase that had been returned, inspecting its contents. Boots, rows of polished leather, untouched, too clean, too perfect. His mind raced smuggling, coded messages, perhaps even assassination plans. But if someone needed to steal or swap the bag, why return it untouched? Unless it was never about the bag itself, but rather about what had been inside, and was now. His fingers traced the lining, feeling for inconsistencies, and then a nearly invisible slit. "Senator," Hayes called over his shoulder, "did you carry anything unusual in this bag?" Whitmore frowned. "No.
Yeah.
Just travel essentials." Hayes pulled at the false lining, and his blood ran cold. Tucked inside, hidden within the bag itself, was a note, hastily scrawled in trembling letters. "Help me. They know." Hayes slowly exhaled. This wasn't just a missing bag, this was a warning, and somewhere out there, someone. was running out of time. The leather suitcase sat on the desk, its brass clasps gleaming under the dim office light. Detective Jonathan Gray leaned forward, drumming his fingers thoughtfully. Across from him, Henry Caldwell, the personal valet of Ambassador Lawrence, shifted uneasily in his chair. "It was a mix-up, sir," Henry began, his voice measured but tense. "The bags were switched, simple as that. I retrieved what I believed to be Mr. Lawrence's suitcase from the docks, but later a gentleman arrived claiming the mix-up. He said the bag belonged to Senator Aldridge." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "And this gentleman, what did he look like?" "Middle-aged, sir. Salt and pepper hair, well-dressed, polite, but something about him felt rehearsed, as if he had memorized a role rather than lived it." Henry hesitated before continuing. He seemed in a hurry, barely glanced inside before latching the suitcase shut and leaving. Jonathan's sharp eyes didn't miss the flicker of doubt crossing Henry's face. "Something's bothering you." Henry exhaled, rubbing his hands together. "It's probably nothing, sir, but before he arrived, I had just started to open that suitcase. The straps were stiff, as if it hadn't been touched in a while. But when I flipped the lid," he paused. Jonathan leaned in. "Yes, it wasn't packed like a diplomat's bag. No official documents, no neatly folded suits, just boots." "Boots?" Jonathan echoed, intrigued. "Yes, sir, several pairs, all the same size, immaculate, unworn. It struck me as odd. Who travels with nothing but pristine boots?" Jonathan tapped his pen against his notepad, his mind racing through possibilities. "Tell me, Henry, was the ambassador's actual bag unpacked when you retrieved it?" Henry shook his head. "No, sir, it was precisely as I had packed it aboard the ship. Whoever received it must have realized the mistake immediately and closed it back up. And yet," Jonathan mused, "the swapped bag had already been opened before you had the chance to check inside properly. Someone had looked inside before it left your hands." A silence settled between them before Henry cleared his throat. "There was one more thing. A young woman, a passenger. She fell ill, just outside Mr. Lawrence's cabin. Asked me to fetch the ship's doctor." Jonathan stiffened. "Describe her." "Petite, dark-haired, striking eyes. Something about them lingered with me. Said her name was Evelyn Moreau. She seemed genuinely unwell, so I left her on the lounge sofa while I searched for the doctor." Henry's brow furrowed, but when I returned with him, she was already on her feet, as if nothing had happened, smiled, thanked me, and vanished into the crowd. Jonathan's grip tightened around his pen. A mistaken identity, a bag full of boots, a woman collapsing outside the ambassador's cabin, only to recover the moment she was left alone. The pieces were there, but the puzzle remained unsolved. His instincts told him this was no simple mix-up. This was something far more deliberate. And if he didn't move fast, he had a feeling the next misplaced item wouldn't be a suitcase, but a life. Toby leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he absorbed every word. "What do you make of it, Eleanor?" he asked, tapping his fingers against the desk. Eleanor, ever perceptive, gave a small smile. "Oh, Toby, you know sudden fainting spells are always suspicious. Too convenient, too dramatic. And Eileen O'Hara, it almost sounds fabricated, too perfectly Irish." Toby exhaled sharply. "At least we have a name, and I know exactly what I'm going to do next. I'm going to put out an advertisement, a call for information on Miss Eileen O'Hara, who traveled on the Celestial Star last week. If she's innocent, she might reach out. If she's not, someone else might come forward." Eleanor gave him a knowing look. "You realize, of course, that you're warning her. If she's involved, she'll go into hiding." Toby shrugged. "It's a risk worth taking." Eleanor frowned. "Still, none of this makes sense. If someone stole the diplomat's case for just a few hours and then returned it, why? There were no classified papers inside, nothing worth copying." Toby's expression darkened, gears turning in his mind. "You just made a good point, Eleanor. A very good point." 2 days later, Toby sat alone in his office, sifting through the latest crime novel when his assistant Miles appeared at the door. "A Miss Cecilia Marks to see you, sir. She says she's here about the advertisement." Toby sat up straight. "Send her in." The door opened, and a young woman stepped inside, fair-haired, wide-eyed, visibly nervous. But before she could even utter a word, the door behind her burst open with violent force. A tall, menacing figure stood there, dark eyes blazing, his scarlet tie stark against his black coat. He leveled a gun at Toby, his voice smooth yet deadly. "So this is the great Mr. Tobias Crane, meddler extraordinaire. Hands where I can see them, or I shoot." Toby's hands went up, and Cecilia let out a small terrified gasp. The stranger sneered. "The girl comes with me." "Oh yes, my dear. I don't care if you know me or not. You saw something aboard the Celestial Star, something you shouldn't have, and I can't have you running to your new detective friend, can I? Clever ploy, Mr. Crane, with your little advertisements, but I too keep an eye on the papers, and now you pay the price for your curiosity." Tasha leaned forward, her sharp gaze fixed on Daniel. "Tell me, Daniel, what do you make of this?" Daniel smirked, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "Oh Tasha, sudden fainting spells, too convenient, and Eileen O'Hara as well, almost too perfectly suspicious, don't you think?" Tasha nodded. "At least it's a start, and do you know what I'm going to do, Daniel? I'm going to bait her." Daniel arched an eyebrow. "Bait her? How?" "An ad. A public call for any information on Miss Eileen O'Hara, last seen traveling on the Seraphine, on the night of the disappearance. If she's innocent, she might step forward. If not, someone will." Daniel tapped his fingers against the desk, deep in thought. "You realize you're putting her on alert. She'll know someone is watching." Tasha shrugged. "Risk is part of the game. But tell me this, what would a group of criminals want with the ambassador's bag for a few hours, and then return it untouched? Unless," her voice trailed off. Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Unless they weren't after what was inside the bag at all. They needed the bag itself." His mind raced. "Tasha, that gives me an idea." 2 days later, Daniel sat alone in the dimly lit office of Harrison & Company Investigations, flipping through the pages of a gripping crime novel. The air smelled of old paper and stale coffee. Just as he turned a page, the door creaked open. "Sir, a young lady to see you," announced Robert, the firm's assistant, Miss Celia Marsh. "Says she's here about the advertisement." Daniel's heart quickened. "Send her in." A moment later, a slender woman with striking blonde hair entered, her cautious blue eyes scanning the room. But before she could speak, the office door flew open with a bang. A towering figure loomed in the doorway, a man with slick black hair, a scar running down his cheek, and a blood-red scarf tied at his neck. His dark eyes burned with fury. In his gloved hand a pistol gleamed under the light. "So this is the den of Mr. Harrison the meddler," he sneered, his voice dangerously smooth. "Hands up or I put a bullet between your eyes." Daniel's hands went up instinctively. Celia let out a strangled gasp. Pressing herself against the wall, the stranger stepped forward. "This girl comes with me." Celia's breath hitched. "What? I don't even know you." "That doesn't matter," the man hissed. "I don't tolerate interference. You were on the Seraphine. You saw something you shouldn't have. Now, before you spill secrets to this detective, I'll ensure you never speak again." Daniel's mind raced. The man had been watching the advertisement columns. He had walked straight into a trap meant for someone else. But just as Daniel considered his next move, something happened. A shadow moved behind the gunman. Unseen, Robert had crept back into the office, a thick rope coiled in his hands. In one swift motion, he tossed the loop over the man's head and yanked. The man roared in fury, toppling backward. His finger jerked on the trigger. Bang! The bullet sliced past Daniel's ear, so close that he felt the heat of it. A sharp crack echoed as it embedded into the wooden bookshelf behind him. Daniel's heart pounded. "You lunatic," he shouted at Robert. "He almost shot me in the head." Robert, flushed with excitement, grinned. "Roped him good though, sir. Been practicing my lasso skills." The gunman struggled, cursing in a foreign tongue, but Daniel stepped forward, yanking the pistol from his grasp. "And now," Daniel said coldly, "we're going to find out exactly what game you're playing." Celia, still trembling, whispered, "You think this is over?" Daniel turned to her, his expression dark. "No, this is just the beginning. Tommy's keen eyes never left the stranger's face as he spoke, but his mind was racing. The words were a threat, sharp, direct, and full of menace. But Tommy had heard threats before, and what truly unsettled him wasn't the warning, it was what lay just beyond the man's shoulder. His heart skipped a beat. Albert. Tommy had assumed Albert had been neutralized, maybe lying unconscious somewhere, but there he was standing in the doorway, coiled rope in hand, eyes gleaming with determination. The sight sent a jolt of apprehension through Tommy. Albert, for all his loyalty, had a habit of acting first and thinking later, and sure enough, before Tommy could utter a word of warning, Albert moved. The rope snapped through the air like a striking snake, looping over the stranger's head. With a fierce tug, Albert yanked him backward. Chaos erupted. The stranger's gun went off, a deafening crack that made the air tremble. Tommy felt the heat of the bullet as it barely missed him. A scorching whisper of death passed his ear before it embedded itself in the wall. Albert, flushed with triumph, beamed. "Got him, sir. Lassoed him proper, just like they do in the Wild West." His enthusiasm was unshaken by the near-fatal shot. Tommy's pulse thundered in his ears. "You absolute idiot," he snapped, helping restrain the flailing intruder. "You almost got me killed. Why in God's name didn't you get the police?" Albert, grinning as he wrestled with the struggling man, replied cheerfully, "Didn't seem sporting, sir. Thought I'd handle it myself." Tommy sighed, tightening the bindings. He turned his attention back to the captive, who spat foreign curses with venomous rage. The man's eyes were wild, burning with something deeper than mere fury, fear. Miss March, still pale and shaken, stepped forward. "What do we do with him?" Tommy considered it for a moment, then a slow smirk crept across his face. "I think a little lesson in manners is overdue." Dragging the man to his feet, Tommy briskly marched him toward the office door. A second later, a series of frantic yelps echoed down the stairwell, followed by a heavy thud. When Tommy returned, dusting off his hands, Miss March stared at him in wide-eyed astonishment. "Did you hurt him?" she asked hesitantly. Tommy grinned. "Oh, I hope so. But you know how these types are. Yell before they're even touched." Albert, ever helpful, raised the rope. "Shall I keep my lasso handy, sir, in case he comes back?" Tommy shot him a look. "Put that away, before you accidentally strangle yourself." Albert sighed, but obeyed. Tommy turned to Miss March, gesturing for her to sit. "Now, let's pick up where we left off. You were saying something about a woman, Miss O'Hara, on the Nomadic, and I suspect, given our recent visitor, you know far more than you're letting on." Miss March hesitated. "I was a passenger on that ship, and so was she. But something happened, something I saw that I shouldn't have." Tommy leaned forward, intrigued. "Go on." She took a shaky breath. "It was the American ambassador's cabin. I was walking past when I saw her inside, and she was doing something strange. She was holding a man's boot, slitting open the lining with a tiny pair of scissors. Then she carefully slid something inside." Tommy's mind sharpened. "A boot?" he repeated. Miss March nodded. Before I could see more, she suddenly collapsed onto the couch, pretending to be faint. Just then, the ship's doctor and another man arrived, rushing to her aid. But I swear, moments before she was perfectly fine. Tommy's pulse quickened. And? I was curious, maybe foolishly so. I waited until the corridor was empty, then slipped inside the ambassador's cabin. I picked up the boot and felt around the lining. There was something there, folded paper. I took it and left quickly before anyone saw me. She hesitated, her voice dropping to a whisper. When I unfolded it in my cabin, it wasn't a letter, it wasn't anything coded, it was just Bible verses. Tommy went still. A creeping chill ran up his spine. He had encountered codes before, hidden in ways only the trained eye could see. And if someone had gone through the trouble of smuggling verses in such a manner, it could only mean one thing. Something much, much bigger was at play. The dimly lit room was thick with tension. Tommy, his sharp eyes never leaving the girl's face, caught the faintest shake of her head, almost imperceptible, but enough. He played along, his voice light but laced with warning. "All right, we'll be generous this time," he mused, his grip tightening ever so slightly on the trembling man's collar. "However, let's make one thing clear, manners are important." With a swift movement, he yanked the rope free, hauled the man to his feet, and with an effortless push, sent him stumbling through the outer office. A series of panicked yelps echoed down the hallway, ending in a heavy thud. Tommy returned, his expression composed but a hint of satisfaction glimmering in his eyes. The girl stared at him, wide-eyed. "Did you hurt him?" Tommy smirked, adjusting his cuffs. "I sincerely hope so," he remarked. "But these types tend to scream before they even feel a scratch. Hard to say." He turned back to Albert. "We shouldn't have any more interruptions, but if we do..." Albert, ever ready, twirled the lasso in his hand. "I'll handle it, sir." Tommy shook his head. "Put it away. No need for theatrics, yet." He gestured for the girl to follow him back into the office. As he settled into his chair, she took a deep breath, still slightly shaken. I don't know where to start," she admitted. "But as you heard, that man knew I was on the Nomadic, and the woman you advertised about, Miss O'Hara, was on that ship too." Tommy leaned forward, his interest piqued. "That much we know, but there's more, isn't there?" The girl hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. Something happened on board that ship, something I didn't understand at the time, but now, looking back, I think I was meant to see it." Tommy gestured for her to continue. "The American ambassador was a passenger. One day, I was walking past his cabin when I saw Miss O'Hara inside. She was doing something unusual. She had a man's boot in her hands." "A boot?" Tommy's curiosity sharpened. "Yes," she confirmed. "She was carefully slitting the lining open with a small pair of scissors, and then she slipped something inside." Just then voices approached, the ship's doctor, and another man. The moment she heard them, she dropped the boot, collapsed onto the couch, and groaned like she was in pain. "A distraction," Tommy "Exactly. At first I thought she had really fainted, but I had seen her only moments before, perfectly fine, completely focused on what she was doing. The act was too sudden." Tommy nodded, motioning for her to go on. "I couldn't shake my curiosity. What had she hidden? A weapon? A document?" I let my imagination run wild. So later, when no one was around, I slipped into the cabin. I picked up the boot, reached into the lining, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Just as I was about to examine it, I heard footsteps, so I ran. Tommy arched an eyebrow. "And what did you find?" The girl hesitated. "At first, nothing. It was just a slip of paper with Bible verses. I thought maybe she was just religious. I kept it without much thought, until yesterday." Tommy's eyes narrowed. "What changed?" She hesitated, looking embarrassed. "I was playing with my little nephew. I folded the paper into a tiny boat for him to sail in the bath. When the paper got wet, something happened. Strange markings appeared all over it, like a hidden message, a map of some kind. It looked like a harbor, and then I saw your advertisement." Tommy shot to his feet. Of course, a stolen document, most likely a military defense map. That woman was smuggling it, but she panicked and hid it. Then when she retrieved the boot, she must have realized the paper was gone. His voice sharpened. "Do you still have it?" The girl nodded. "It's locked in my office safe." Tommy grabbed his coat. "We need to get it to Scotland Yard, immediately." The girl stood, but a flicker of doubt crossed her face. "Do you really think I'm in danger?" Tommy's voice was firm. "I don't think, I know." He turned to Albert, scribbled a quick note, and handed it to him. "If anyone asks, I've been called out on urgent business." Albert took the note solemnly. "And what about the Duchess's pearls, sir?" Tommy smirked. "They'll have to wait." With that he and the girl hurried out, unaware that just beyond the door, someone else had been listening all along. Tommy's eyes narrowed as he scanned the dimly lit street. The chill of the evening air carried a strange tension, an unseen force lurking in the shadows. Miss March hesitated beside him, her fingers instinctively clutching her handbag tighter. A taxi slowed down a few feet ahead, its driver eyeing them keenly. Tommy noted the way the man's gaze lingered, a little too long, a little too focused. Then just as suddenly, the driver shook his head at a passerby, who attempted to hail the cab. That was enough. Tommy turned to Miss March, his voice steady but urgent. "We're being watched. That taxi was waiting for us. If we get in, we may not get out." A flicker of fear crossed her face, but she quickly masked it with a nod. "What do we do?" "We walk." Threading through the bustling crowd, they moved briskly. Tommy remained alert, his sharp gaze flicking over every reflection in the shop windows, every shifting shadow in the alleyways. More than once, he subtly steered Miss March away from figures that seemed a little too interested in their movement. As they neared Bond Street, Miss March's breathing grew heavier. Sensing her fatigue, Tommy led her into a quiet cafe. The warm aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, momentarily masking the tension crackling between them. "Drink this," he said, pushing a steaming cup toward her, "and stay alert." They sat longer than necessary, allowing the lull of ordinary cafe chatter to serve as their temporary shield. Tommy's fingers tapped lightly on the table, a calculated rhythm of thought. Outside, the world moved on, but he could feel it. Danger was circling, tightening. Finally, they stepped out. Cyclamen Limited was just a short walk away, a small establishment with delicate pink curtains and neatly arranged cosmetic jars in the display. At first glance, it was utterly unremarkable, but as soon as they entered, Tommy knew something was off. A poised woman behind the counter barely glanced at them, her expression carefully neutral. A dark-haired customer, her back to them, spoke in deliberately slow English, too deliberate, as if she wanted every word to be overheard. On the sofa, two men lounged, pretending disinterest. Miss March walked straight through the back door, holding it open for Tommy. But just as he crossed the threshold, a voice rang out. But I think that is an old friend of mine." The dark-haired woman spun around, and Tommy barely had time to register the sharp intelligence in her eyes before she lunged forward, jamming her foot between the door. At that exact moment, the two men stood, their previous laziness vanishing in an instant. One advanced toward the counter, blocking the entrance. The other followed the woman's lead, stepping in after them. Tommy's pulse spiked. The trap had been sprung. Tommy barely had time to react before a strong arm seized him, and something rough and suffocating was pressed over his face. A sickly sweet scent invaded his nostrils, forcing a wave of dizziness through his mind. But just as his knees buckled, the cloth was yanked away, and a piercing scream shattered the air. Tommy staggered, blinking rapidly to clear his vision. In front of him, a chaotic scene unfolded. The enigmatic man he had encountered earlier was now struggling violently as an unassuming shop attendant, his previous air of disinterest, now replaced with cool efficiency, snapped handcuffs onto his wrists. To Tommy's left, Cicely March, her face contorted with panic, thrashed desperately in a futile attempt to escape the firm grip of a woman clad in elegant attire, but as the woman shifted, her delicate veil slipped, revealing the unmistakable, determined features of Tuppence. "Well played, Tuppence," Tommy remarked, stepping forward, his usual light-heartedness edged with steel. "Allow me to assist. I wouldn't struggle if I were you, Miss O'Hara, or should I say Miss March." Tuppence cast him a wry glance. "This is Inspector Grace, Tommy. The moment I read your note, I contacted Scotland Yard. The inspector and his team were waiting just outside." The inspector, his eyes sharp and calculating, nodded. "This one's been on our radar for months," he said, nudging his prisoner forward. "But this beauty shop, never suspected a thing. Brilliant front." Tommy smiled faintly. "A beauty shop wouldn't need an hour with the ambassador's bag," he mused. "So I asked myself, what if the bag itself wasn't the target? What if something needed to be inside it for a short while? Diplomatic luggage is never inspected, which makes it the perfect vessel for smuggling. But what? Nothing bulky, nothing obvious. Drugs seemed the logical answer. Then came the staged theatrics in my office, the absurd attempt to divert me or, if necessary, eliminate me. But I caught a flicker of real fear in our charming lady's eyes when Albert made his move. That didn't align with her act. It became clear, the attacker was meant to reinforce her credibility. I played along, letting her lead me here while ensuring full backup was in place. Cicely March's icy gaze locked onto him. "You're insane. You won't find anything here. Tommy's grin didn't waver. Oh, I beg to differ. Inspector, shall we start with the bath salts? The inspector lifted a delicate pink tin, upending it onto the table. Crystals scattered harmlessly across the polished surface. Cicely let out a mocking laugh. See? Harmless. Tommy's eyes gleamed. Let's check the safe, shall we? The small wall safe was already unlocked. Tommy swung the door open, and his breath caught. Beyond the visible compartment, a hidden recess was stacked high with identical tins. He pried one open, brushing aside the top layer of innocent-looking crystals. Beneath lay a fine white powder. The inspector's expression darkened. Pure cocaine, he confirmed grimly. We've been tracking a West End distribution network, but this is the jackpot. Tommy turned to Tuppence, his voice light but triumphant. Chalk up another win for Blunt's brilliant detectives. Turns out, your relentless lessons on hair dye detection have finally paid off. Real gold still fools me, but peroxide never will. Now let's draft a concise professional letter to the ambassador, letting him know the matter is resolved. And then, my dear, what do you say to a celebratory tea, with an abundance of hot buttered muffins,